One of the things I should mention about these early 3 and 4 track machines is that their capabilities were very limited. You could either play all the tracks at one time, or you could record all the tracks at one time, but you couldn't intermix recording and playing back different tracks. It was all or nothing. So essentially, we had a playhead here that would play the tracks as they would go by the playhead. These tracks were either on or in record, or they were not in record. Having that in mind, the only way that they could get larger recordings would be to take two separate machines and slave them together. So what they did, what the producers did, was they would have two machines slaved together. In other words, slaved together, that term means that this machine was locked to this machine. So when this machine would play, this machine would play, and they would stay synchronized. Their tape speed would be identical, and the exact same location on each tape would cross the playhead at the same time. Now, being able to slave two machines together gave them 4 tracks on each machine that they could play with. And what they did was the same kind of thing that they had done before. They put maybe drums here, bass here, guitars, and more guitars. So now they got a completed rhythm section. And if that's the performance that they wanted, then they would take these 4 tracks and they would sum them down. In other words, they would bounce them down or reduce them down to this other machine. So while this machine, tape machine 1, was recording or was playing back, this machine, tape machine 2, was recording. So essentially what you could have then would be this. These 2 guitars go to this guitar or this track, and maybe these drums and this bass go to that track. Now, one thing about this, so you're doing a sum of these 2, so now you've got drums and bass, and you've got guitars and more guitars. Now you've got these 4 instruments now on 2 tracks. So while they were recording these elements onto this track, these elements onto this track, they would also record some new elements at the same time. Maybe they wanted to record some vocals. So they record 2 tracks of vocals. Same time they're bouncing this down. Now you've heard me use this term, bouncing down. There was a few terms that they used. Bouncing down. In Britain they called it reduction mixes, and you also have heard the term dubbing down. These were the 3 terms that they would often use for this same process. Bouncing down, reduction mixes, and dubbing down. Essentially, you're summing multiple tracks into fewer tracks. And that's what this process was. Now, what's fascinating about this is that while they were doing this, back then, there was no undo. There was no Command-Z. So you got what you got. You had to make sure that these levels between the drums and the bass, when they went to this track, were exactly what you wanted. And the levels between the guitars and more guitars tracks were exactly what you wanted, because you couldn't undo it. So there was no going back. So an amazing process, and some of the great Beatles recordings, some of the early Beach Boys recordings were done using these types of processes. Sgt. Pepper's, I believe, is one of the projects the Beatles did where they recorded this way. And you got to remember, each time that they're bouncing down, they're also adding noise, because tape machines are noisy. So you had to be real careful when you were bouncing down that you maintained, as best you could, a pristine recording. One of the great innovations in multi-track recording came in the 1950s when guitarist Les Paul, many of you have probably heard that name because he has famous guitars that are named after him, made by the Gibson Guitar Company. So Gibson Les Paul, real common, real popular guitar. He came up with the idea of being able to record individual tracks at different times. In other words, remember this playhead we talked about? How we had a playhead here? His invention, his concept was, what if we can record and enable these individual tracks individually? They don't all have to be on or off. That way, once we get some tracks recorded and we like them, we can still record on that same piece of tape in that same area without recording over pre-existing tracks. And he worked with the Ampex tape company, who also made tape machines at the time, and they came up with this design that allowed them to record individual tracks separately. Didn't have to be all recorded at once. And this really revolutionized the way recording was done. And music is still recorded using this process today. Let me give you an example of how this might be accomplished. So first of all, let's say we're going to record our rhythm section. So we have the same thing. We have drums, bass, guitars. Maybe we're going to do a piano that's a stereo piano. So we're going to go piano right and left. Okay, and then we've got 3 tracks left. So maybe once the rhythm section is down and we're happy with how they recorded together, then we want the lead vocalist to come in. And because he can put this individual track into record, okay, separate from all these others, he can go and sing along with the band and record his vocal, and if he doesn't like it, he can go back, re-record a new vocal. Go back, erase it, record a new vocal. Go back, erase it, record a new vocal, until he gets the one that he wants. And then once the lead vocal's down, then maybe we have the background singers come in. And we have them lay down a couple of background tracks. Okay? And the same thing, they could go in and they could record their background tracks as many times as they wanted, because they could put these 2 tracks into record separately from these. That was Les Paul's great invention and great contribution to multi-track recording. Now the process that we're discussing here, there's a name for it, and they call it overdubbing or stacking. Okay, overdubbing essentially is what we discussed right up here. It's going and after the fact coming back in and recording separate tracks on top of pre-existing material. You're overlaying or overdubbing over the top of existing material, new material. Now the idea of stacking would be when you took and maybe took the same vocal and you actually sung the exact vocal as best you could, you created an exact duplicate performance for the purpose of thickening up the performance. A good example of that is in like a country tune, where you'll have the acoustic guitar player play one pass or one track of his part, and then you pan him over to this speaker, and then you have him play the exact same part and you pan it over to this speaker. And so it is a way of creating a nice widening effect in your recording. That's called stacking. One of the artists that used stacking amazingly well and to the extreme was Enya. In the 80s and early 90s, she came up with this idea of stacking her voice a lot of times, 80, 90 different times, to create this wall of vocal sound that she was known for. And she did this by the same process. She would stack her voice many times. So say she was doing 4 parts, 4 vocal parts, she would stack each vocal part 8 times. So 8 tracks of vocal part 1. Vocal part 1, 8 tracks. And then down here, she would do vocal part 2, and she would do 8 tracks. Vocal part 3, 8 tracks, etc. So you can see right there we've already got 24 tracks of vocals. So if she had 6 or 8 different parts, you could easily see that she could get up to 50, 60, 70 vocal tracks. Okay? That is the process called stacking.